So, one of the harder lessons I learned during my years of law practice was that nothing seems to bring the worst out in people more than the possibility of an inheritance. Ordinary people who seem very kind and loving and thoughtful, people who seem to have their priorities in order, people who wore crosses around their necks and had Jesus fish stickers on the backs of their cars, I saw turn on each other viciously over land or money or jewelry or furniture or even small household goods. I have a dear friend and colleague that tells a heartbreaking story about a woman in his congregation who came to see him about a family dispute involving a chess set. Her son had died young and tragically and left behind a young wife and a little boy, her grandson. And in the year before her son died, this woman had given her son a very expensive hand-carved chess set. And after he died, she demanded that it be returned to her. But unbeknownst to her, her son had turned around and gifted that chess set to his son, to her grandson. And in fact, the chess set was in the little boy's room on a table, and he looked at it and played with it often. So when she asked to have it back, her daughter-in-law said, "No, I'd rather not return it to you because your son gave it to our son, and I think it's something he should keep so that he can remember his father." But the woman would not hear of it. She continued to insist that the chess set was hers and she wanted it returned to her. And when her daughter-in-law kept trying to engage her in conversation to work it out, finally one day she just cut her off. She cut off relationship with her daughter-in-law and her young grandson over this. Well, my friend, who was her pastor, listened patiently to this story, and then he said to the woman, "You know, you're paying an awfully high price. Can't you just let this go? You don't really want to end your relationship with your only grandchild over a chess set, do you?" And the woman's response was, "You don't understand. That chess set is mine." And that was the end of it. Friends, can you imagine a grandparent cutting off relationship with their own daughter-in-law and their own grandchild, their only grandchild, over a material item like a chess set? And yet, friends, we are perfectly capable of doing that. We human beings find stuff often so seductive, and we can fall in love with it to a point that we get our priorities turned upside down. We can end up loving the stuff more than people or God, and I've seen this happen numerous times. Once I worked with a family that was arguing over an oil and gas lease, and you would have thought they were the Hatfields and the McCoys. They destroyed their family over this property, but they didn't seem to care. They seem to care so much more about the money than the people involved. You see, that's what happens when we get our priorities upside down and we don't rein that in, we don't check it. Well, then ultimately our love for stuff can take precedence over everything, even people that we love, even our relationship with God. And friends, that is why Jesus warns us to be on guard against all kinds of greed. Or as the King James Version of the Bible puts it, beware of covetousness. Friends, I've heard covetousness defined as wanting more of what we already have enough of. Wanting more of what we already have enough of. I doubt that many of us would think of ourselves as greedy, but wanting more of what we already have enough of, I don't know about you, but that kind of hits close to home. Well, our text this morning begins with a family dispute over an inheritance. A man emerges from the crowd and says to Jesus, "Tell my brother to give me my share of the family estate." Apparently, he doesn't feel that he is getting his due. But Jesus refuses to play judge. And instead, I think he surprises the man by saying, "Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." And then, as he was so apt to do, Jesus tells a story. He says there was a farmer who already had plenty. His barns were filled to the rafters, and yet still his land produced abundantly, and he wondered what to do. So he thought, and then he decided, well, what I will do is I will tear down these barns and I will build even bigger ones, and then I will fill them up. There will be ample room for my grain and my goods, and then I will feel satisfied. I will feel secure. I will eat, drink, and be merry. And then God says, "You fool, this very night, your life is being demanded from you, and these things that you have prepared, who will they belong to? Only a fool stores up treasures from themselves, but is not rich toward God." Pretty harsh words from Jesus. He's not really mincing words here, is he? It's a not so subtle reminder that, as my grandmother used to say, there are no pockets and shrouds. You're not going to see a hearse drive by towing a U-Haul. But there's more to it, friends. This is more than just a reminder that life is short and you can't take it with you. No, there's something else here, and it has to do with greed and what it can do to us. And in this regard, I think that verse 20 can be of help. Now, verse 20 in the translation we read this morning says, "This very night your life is being demanded from you." But the literal Greek of verse 20 says, "This night they," meaning the possessions, "demand your soul." This night they, meaning the possessions, demand your soul. Read through this lens, friends, I think we can begin to see what's really going on with this farmer, because until the voice of God breaks in, every word this guy says is about his stuff. My land, my barns, my grain, my ample goods. His priorities are upside down. He thinks that he is building an abundant life, but in reality, he is becoming a slave to his stuff. Several years ago, my mother asked me what I wanted for my birthday, and I told her the truth. I wanted a really big bird feeder, and she gave it to me, and I love it. Now, I know that says something about a person when their dream birthday present is a bird feeder, but I'll deal with that in another sermon. Anyway, I love my bird feeder. It's a really big one. It's one of those long tubes, and it has 4 feeding stations on it. And when we got it, I ran to the store and filled it up with seed, and I hung it outside our kitchen window, and it seemed like it was just a magnet instantly for birds. All the birds in the area just flocked to my feeder. All of the feeding stations were full. There were always birds on the ground waiting their turn. It was great. And we went through seed like crazy. We finally went out and bought that industrial-sized bag that you have to keep in the garage in a trash can. We were just refilling that thing daily. And then one day we noticed that the number of birds coming to our feeder seemed to have dropped off pretty dramatically. And we wondered why. At first we thought maybe it was a seasonal thing. But then we figured it out. A great big blue jay had moved into the neighborhood. Friends, blue jays are vicious. I don't know if you know this, but they are. So this blue jay moved in, and he decided that that feeder belonged to him. It was his, and no other birds were allowed to eat there. So he set up shop. You see, what he would do is he would eat, and then he would retreat to a nearby tree branch and watch. 24/7 guard duty. And when another bird would come and try to feed, he would try to chase him off. And in fact, the only time he ever left is when he was chasing away a trespasser. Well, at first, this seemed to work pretty well for him because we noticed he got a little bit fatter as he was eating all the seed he could possibly hold. But then we noticed something else. He paid a price for the obsession with his feeder. Because while he was on guard duty 24/7, he was just sort of chained there, you know? Because of his greed, he lost his freedom to come and go as he pleased. It seemed that he was possessed by his possession. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, says Jesus, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. Friends, when we get our priorities upside down and we put stuff first, that is not the way to abundant life. It is, in fact, the way of death. Death of our freedom as we become slaves to our stuff and the desire for more. Death of our relationships as we put money and things over people. And death of our joy as we find out the hard way that there is no such thing as ample goods, and the barns are never big enough, and you can eat, drink, and be merry all day long, and ultimately it will not satisfy. Friends, so many people in our culture are sick with greed, wanting more of what they already have enough of. And dare I say, never has so much meant so little to so many. I'll close with this. Back in 1991, a very powerful movie came out called The Doctor, starring William Hurt. I don't know if you've seen that movie. It is awfully old now, but I think you can watch it on Netflix, and I highly recommend it. Well, in this movie, Hurt plays this doctor who is a rather glib sort of fellow, emotionless, non-empathetic, has very poor bedside manner, just no rapport whatsoever with his patients. Well, there's a scene in the movie where a man and his family come to see this doctor because the man has been very, very ill, and he's undergone some testing, and he's there for the results, and he's afraid the results will be bad. So the man and his family come in, and they sit down on this couch in the doctor's office. And then the doctor very unceremoniously tells the man that yes, the test results are very bad and there's not a lot of hope for him. And it's a shocking moment. Even though the man suspected it, it was just such a terrible thing to hear, and you can see that register on his face, and you can see him try to process this. And then he says to the doctor, "Doctor, you're going to have to help me. I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're telling me." And in this very non-emotional way, the doctor says, "Sir, what I'm telling you is if I were you, I'd get my affairs in order." And again, all this emotion registers on the man's face, and he looks like he's going to cry. And then he reaches out his arms and he puts them around his family, around his wife and his children. And very quietly, he says to the doctor, "Sir, my affairs are in order." Friends, are your affairs in order? Does your life, the way you're living it, reflect the priorities that God has put on your heart? This text is such a gift, I think. And it comes to us from Christ, who loves us more than we can possibly imagine. And what Christ wants for each one of us is truly abundant life, and yet he understands how seduced we are by stuff in the way of death. So we are offered this lesson and this opportunity to ask these hard questions, not so that we can feel guilty, but so that we can walk a path that leads to real life. Friends, is the way you're living reflective of the real priorities of your heart? The way you love, the way you spend your time, the way you give. For Jesus says, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. For one's life does not consist of the abundance of possessions. Will you pray with me? Most loving God, we give you thanks, for you are the source of every good and perfect gift. We are merely stewards of all that you have entrusted to us, O God. Forgive us for our tendency to fall in love with money and things. And help us always, Lord, to set our priorities straight, loving you first, and God and neighbor. It's in Christ's name that we pray. Amen.